There's a specific moment in a man's life when getting out of bed stops feeling like a physical task and starts feeling like a philosophical question. You wake up, your eyes open, and before a single thought forms, your body speaks first. It says, quietly but firmly, no. Not a dramatic collapse, not a despairing cry, just a refusal that feels older than your adult life, almost instinctive, as if your system has already decided something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. For many men, this becomes a private ritual. You lie there, not because you want to waste the day, but because standing up feels like stepping into a life that no longer fits. And the mistake most men make, usually within the first minute of judging themselves, is assuming this means they're weak, undisciplined, or falling behind other people. That misinterpretation, the belief that your exhaustion is a moral failure, is often the first wound that keeps the collapse going. When you look a little deeper, the urge to lie down all day often carries a quieter truth, the collapse of telos, the sense of inner direction that puts a man in motion. When that direction erodes, the body stops cooperating. You can still think, still plan, still imagine change, but something in the nervous system refuses to rise for a story it no longer believes in. Jung would say the psyche withdraws its agreement. It stops negotiating with a path that has drifted too far from your real center. Many men think this withdrawal is personal or unique, but you can see versions of it across cultures. On forums in Brazil, Turkey, Japan, the US, men describe the same image: horizontal living, not sleep, not rest. A position where the world stops demanding and the self stops performing. A position where, for a brief moment, no one expects excellence, competence, clarity, charm, or certainty. A position where the body can finally say what the mind has been postponing. I can't keep moving like this. From a physiological angle, this isn't laziness. The nervous system is not malfunctioning, it's protesting. When stress, shame, or self-betrayal accumulate without relief, the body enters an energy conservation mode. Polyvagal researchers describe it as the dorsal state, a shutdown that protects more than it punishes. Your body is not giving up on you. It's refusing to run a program that is hurting you, and that refusal often arrives first as bone-deep fatigue. But here is the emotional hook underneath all of this. What if the urge to lie down all day is not proof that you're failing, but a coded message from your shadow? Not the dark, dramatic version of the shadow people imagine, but the quieter one, the part of you that carries the truths you didn't have permission to express. When the shadow is consistently ignored, it doesn't always explode. Sometimes it removes the fuel. It tells your energy, stop cooperating until he listens. There is a symbolic dimension here that Jung understood well. Withdrawal, especially the involuntary kind, often signals that the conscious life has drifted too far from something essential. The psyche stops participating in the performance. The inner masculine orientation, the part of you that moves toward goals, direction, purpose, pauses its forward motion, not out of collapse, but out of protest. And yet, even in protest, there is an invitation. If you listen closely, the fatigue isn't saying end. It's saying enough. Enough of the self-negotiations that leave you depleted. Enough of the identities that demand perfection. Enough of the roles you inherited rather than chose. It's a strange kind of compassion the body offers. If you won't put the brakes on a life that is wearing you down, I will. Every few minutes in this video, we'll name a hidden pattern, one you may have lived for years without recognizing it. And here, in the opening, the first pattern is this. You may be interpreting your exhaustion as weakness, when it may actually be the most honest part of you refusing to live a lie. And if you want one small moment of self-observation before we move into the next chapter, here's a micro-practice you can experiment with. When you feel that gravitational pull back into the bed or the couch, pause for 3 quiet breaths and ask, what part of me doesn't want to step into the world today? Not to fix it, not to force action, simply to acknowledge the signal. Often, fatigue softens slightly when it is recognized instead of judged. Stay with me, because later in the video, at the midpoint, we will explore the pattern most men overlook, the one that flips the meaning of this exhaustion entirely. For now, we begin with something simple and difficult at the same time. Your body may not be collapsing. It may be communicating. There is a particular moment in long-term fatigue that most men eventually recognize, though they rarely speak about it. It's the moment when lying still no longer feels like rest. It feels like protection. The body isn't rejuvenating. It's shielding something fragile beneath the surface. And this is where the urge to lie down begins to reveal a second layer of meaning. It becomes a quiet refusal to face realities that feel too heavy to hold upright. Across trauma recovery spaces online, men describe almost the same inner sentence. If I don't move, nothing can collapse. This isn't laziness. It's a strategy, though an unconscious one. Lying down becomes a way to freeze the world. Work deadlines, relational tensions, expectations, the unfinished conversations you keep postponing. Horizontal stillness becomes a refuge from the possibility of failing again, disappointing someone again, or confronting a truth about yourself that feels too destabilizing. This is the part many men misinterpret. They assume the exhaustion means they're weak or uncommitted, when in reality, the shadow may be stepping in to negotiate on their behalf. The shadow doesn't always sabotage aggressively. Sometimes it simply whispers, "We cannot survive another blow like the last one." So it presses the body downward. It slows the impulse to act. It protects you through stillness because you weren't taught another way to protect yourself. From a nervous system lens, this often reflects what polyvagal theory calls defensive immobilization. When effort has been met repeatedly with criticism, failure, or shame, the system learns to equate movement with danger. Instead of gearing up to handle life, it pulls energy downward and inward, conserving the little vitality left. On the outside, you seem fatigued. On the inside, your system is practicing a kind of survival math. If I stay still, nothing bad can happen. Stillness becomes a shield disguised as tiredness. There is a subtle twist here that often surprises men the first time they notice it. Avoidance doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like control. If you don't try, you can't fail. If you don't act, nothing can expose your insecurity. A frozen life may be painful, but at least it's predictable. And predictability, especially for a man carrying unresolved wounds, can feel safer than the uncertainty of growth. Many discover, often reluctantly, that the life they think they're protecting is actually protecting a fragile identity that fears being tested. A revealing pattern often emerges here. The collapse tends to intensify not during difficulty, but immediately after a small success. A good day at work, a positive interaction, the faint beginning of momentum, moments when your story could shift for the better. And yet those are often the evenings when you feel the heaviest, the least capable of movement. This is where the shadow becomes clearest. Success threatens the old narrative of inadequacy it has been holding on to for years. If the story changes, the shadow loses its familiar ground. So it pulls the body back into stillness to preserve what it knows, even if what it knows is painful. If you've ever felt more tired after doing something well than after doing nothing, you may have brushed up against this inner conflict. It isn't failure. It's a sign that some part of you is negotiating an identity you outgrew but haven't replaced. Myth gives us a picture for this. Think of the version of Odysseus who never leaves the shore. The sea is calling, the journey is waiting, but he stays where the ground feels solid. Not because he lacks courage, but because the waves reflect a chaos inside him that he hasn't learned to navigate. The refusal to move is not a lack of desire, but a fear that the voyage will expose him. And here is the reframing line, the one that often lands sharply for the first time. Stillness is not always rest. Sometimes it is the body protecting you from a life you haven't prepared yourself to meet. If you want to explore this gently, there is one small experiment you might consider. When the heaviness arrives, instead of pushing against it or collapsing into it, quietly ask yourself, what would moving forward threaten in me today? Not to solve it, not to overpower it, but to let the truth name itself. Often, the answer is less dramatic than you fear and more revealing than you expect. In the next chapter, we'll see how this stillness slowly transforms into a ritual, how lying down becomes the only sanctuary where your unprocessed emotions finally have permission to surface. At a certain point, fatigue stops behaving like a symptom and starts behaving like a ritual. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, but rhythmic. You lie down at the same moments, in the same ways, with the same quiet sense of inevitability. The body doesn't negotiate or postpone. It simply returns to the horizontal position as if it were the only place where something inside you can breathe. And this is often where the deeper truth begins to surface. Lying down becomes the one environment where you're allowed to stop performing competence. In many men's accounts, there is a recurring confession that rarely makes it into everyday conversation. It sounds like this: "When I'm lying down, I don't have to be anyone." That sentence carries the weight of years. It speaks to the exhaustion of maintaining a persona you were taught to wear too early: strong, steady, impermeable, always understanding, always capable. When the gap between who you feel you are and who you present yourself to be grows too wide, the body creates a backstage. For many men, that backstage is the bed. This is where Jung's idea of the withdrawal of libido becomes quietly illuminating. When your outer life moves in directions that don't reflect your inner truth, the psyche begins to pull back its energy. What once went toward work, relationships, ambitions, even simple daily tasks, gradually retreats inward. The mind becomes busier, even as the body becomes still. Rumination deepens. Fantasies of escape sharpen. Old memories resurface as if they're demanding to be acknowledged. The body lies down while the psyche rises into a kind of internal storm. Here is where a second misinterpretation often appears. Men assume this internal flood means something is broken in them. Yet for many, the opposite is true. The fatigue is not a malfunction. It is a message. It is the psyche interrupting a life that has drifted too far from instinct, purpose, or emotional honesty. What looks like collapse may actually be a demand for integrity, a demand for a life in which you no longer have to compress your inner world to fit an outer role. A reframing line here: exhaustion is sometimes the body's way of telling the truth you have not said aloud. Popular culture occasionally captures this dynamic better than clinical language. In the series, Mr. Robot, Elliot often collapses into bed, not because he lacks strength, but because his internal life is running at a depth that makes ordinary functioning nearly impossible. The horizontal position becomes the only place where his mind can organize itself. Not a sign of weakness, but a confession booth for everything he's carrying alone. Many men recognize themselves in that quiet collapse, even if they've never said it out loud. There is also a more grounded, everyday version of this. A subscriber once wrote something that distills the experience with striking clarity. He said, "I only understood my exhaustion when I realized the bed was the one place where I wasn't negotiating with anyone's expectations." In that realization, he wasn't celebrating the exhaustion. He was naming its truth. He finally saw that his daily life required a degree of self-editing that his system could no longer sustain. The bed became the only place where he could exist without being evaluated. But here's the part that subtly destabilizes the understanding. What begins as sanctuary can gradually turn into a trap. The psyche starts to use immobility as leverage. The body learns that stillness is the only route to safety, so it begins to call for it more often, more intensely. The retreat becomes familiar, comforting even, because it is the one space in which you do not have to negotiate your identity. Yet the comfort comes with a cost. The longer you stay there, the more difficult it becomes to inhabit your life upright. If you want to gently explore this without pressure, one quiet experiment is to observe the moment just before you lie down. Not to prevent it, but to notice what emotion rises right before your body retreats. Many men discover it isn't fatigue at all, but something unprocessed. Grief, shame, fear, disappointment, seeking a private place to surface. In that sense, the horizontal ritual is less about tiredness and more about giving your emotional backlog a place to exist without witness. In the next chapter, this ritual takes an even more striking turn. The body begins to speak in a different language. It stops merely offering sanctuary and starts negotiating on your behalf, stepping in where you feel unable to. This is where fatigue becomes a form of somatic negotiation, and the symbolic weight of lying down grows even deeper. There is a moment in chronic exhaustion that feels different from the others, though it's easy to miss. It's the moment when your fatigue doesn't just feel like tiredness or emotional overflow. It feels strategic, not conscious, not manipulative, but purposeful in a deeper, instinctive way, as if your body has started intervening in your life, stepping in where you have repeatedly overridden your own limits. This is where fatigue becomes a form of negotiation, not just collapse. Many men describe a subtle split inside them, a kind of inner civil war. On one side is the inner tyrant, the voice shaped by pressure, perfectionism, or childhood expectations. It says, keep going, don't slow down. Earn your worth before you rest. On the other side is the inner orphan, the part of you that has carried unexpressed fear, longing, or tenderness for years. It says, please stop. This pace is killing me. When those two forces collide long enough without resolution, the body eventually takes a side. It shuts down not to betray you, but to protect the part of you that has no advocate. This is the landscape where psychology's idea of learned helplessness emerges. When you try and fail repeatedly, maybe in relationships, work, or even in attempts to change yourself, the nervous system begins to anticipate defeat before the situation even unfolds. Effort becomes associated with pain, so the system tries to save energy by preemptively removing motivation. The heaviness you feel is not a lack of will, but a prediction of loss. Your body decides, if the ending is always the same, let's not spend the energy getting there. And here is the destabilizing twist that quietly reveals the truth. Many men believe they are most exhausted when life is falling apart. But for a surprising number, the exhaustion intensifies right after clarity. You see a path forward. You understand what boundary needs to be drawn. You sense the direction your life is trying to move toward. And then, almost instantly, your body collapses. The timing is too consistent to ignore. Progress doesn't energize you. It frightens the part of you that learned to survive by staying small. The body sometimes reacts more violently to hope than to despair. Hope threatens the old identity. If you act on the clarity, you risk becoming someone new, someone unrecognizable to the self who coped through retreat. The shadow often clings to the narrative you built during your hardest years, because that narrative once kept you safe. Change, even positive change, can feel like abandoning the version of you that endured so much. So the body intervenes. It pulls all the energy out of your limbs and whispers, "Not yet. I'm not ready to lose who I was." There's a subtle pattern that reveals when this negotiation is happening. The exhaustion appears at the threshold of decisive action, the moment before sending a message, making a choice, speaking a truth, or stepping into something meaningful. It is not random. It is the shadow defending its territory. A reframing line here. Exhaustion at the doorway of growth is often the body protecting an identity that no longer fits, but still feels necessary. The philosopher Nietzsche once described something he called the spirit's nausea, a visceral revolt that appears when the life you're living contradicts the life you know you're meant to build. It's a powerful idea because it shifts the meaning of fatigue. Instead of seeing tiredness as a flaw, it becomes a signal of internal contradiction. Your system is rejecting the gap between your truth and your behavior. If you want to explore this gently, one quiet option is to notice the exact moment the tiredness spikes. Not to fight it, not to override it, but to ask, what decision was I about to make when my body pulled the plug? Often the answer is the doorway you've been circling for years. In the next chapter, this inner negotiation begins to echo in your relationships. Fatigue becomes not only a private experience, but a silent signal that shapes how you bond, withdraw, and hope to be seen. There is a moment in long-term exhaustion when the fatigue stops being only your private struggle and begins shaping the way you relate to others, often without your awareness. The people around you feel the withdrawal, the heaviness, the quiet disappearance, but they rarely understand what it means. And in truth, many men don't understand it either. What looks like distance on the outside is often something far more vulnerable underneath, a longing for recognition so deep that the only safe way to express it is through retreat. For men who carry an unresolved mother wound, the pattern is especially pronounced. Not necessarily a dramatic childhood story, but a subtle emotional history in which you learn to minimize your needs, silence your distress, or appear self-sufficient to avoid burdening someone who could not meet you emotionally. Over time, that conditioning becomes a template. As an adult, you may not ask for support directly, even when you're drowning. Instead, fatigue becomes the messenger. You don't articulate your loneliness or overwhelm. You lie down, you grow quiet, you disconnect, and somewhere inside, a hope forms. Maybe someone will see it without me having to say it. This is where Jung's idea of projection becomes deeply relevant. A man who has not yet developed his inner feminine, his capacity for emotional awareness, receptivity, and self-soothing, often assigns that role to a partner. He doesn't do this intentionally. It happens automatically, the psyche reaching outward for what it has not cultivated inward. The partner becomes the mirror, the regulator, the one expected to intuit what you cannot express. And when fatigue overtakes you, part of you may unconsciously test the relationship, wondering, will she come to me? Will she notice? Will she bridge the silence I don't know how to cross? This is one of the quiet illusions many men live inside, the belief that withdrawal communicates need clearly, but retreat is an ambiguous language. It can look like rejection even when it's a concealed plea for closeness. Partners often misread the signal. They experience your stillness as disinterest, irritation, or emotional absence, while internally you may be hoping they'll come closer than ever. The distance grows not because anyone intends harm, but because the emotional message is being delivered in a language no one can fully understand. Here is a slightly confronting but clarifying line. Lying down can become a substitute for saying, I don't know how to need you without feeling ashamed. Men rarely pause the video at this point, but many take a breath. Cross-cultural studies on withdrawal show a similar pattern. In Japanese research on hikikomori, analysts found that the young men who isolated themselves were not rejecting connection. They were overwhelmed by the intensity of their desire for it. The longing was so powerful, and the fear of miscommunication or inadequacy so strong, that withdrawal felt like the only safe option. Something similar happens on a quieter scale in many relationships. Exhaustion is not an escape from others, but an attempt to protect oneself from relational exposure that feels threatening. A revealing sign appears when someone asks for your emotional presence. A partner wants a conversation. A friend asks how you're really doing. A family member presses for connection. Instead of responding, your entire body suddenly feels drained, as if the request itself weighs 100 pounds. This isn't disinterest. It's the nervous system signaling, I was never taught how to meet this moment. A reframing line here. The exhaustion you feel around emotional intimacy is not a refusal to engage, but a sign of how much you long for connection without knowing how to hold it. For those who want to explore this gently, one quiet option is to notice what happens internally the next time someone asks for your presence. Not to fix it, not to perform, but simply to observe the shift in your body. Many men discover that the fatigue is carrying a sentence they've never spoken aloud. I want to be close, but I don't feel equipped. In the next chapter, the lens widens even further. Fatigue stops being only psychological or relational and begins to reveal its existential dimension. It becomes a revolt against a story that no longer feels meaningful, and the deepest reversal of the entire narrative appears. There is a turning point in this entire experience, a moment when the exhaustion you feel can no longer be explained only by stress, trauma, or emotional backlog. It begins to resemble something deeper, quieter, and more unsettling. A revolt of the psyche against a life that lacks a living story. Not just a job that feels wrong, or a relationship that has lost warmth, but a deeper misalignment between the life you are living and the life that would feel meaningful to you at a soul level. For many men, this is the layer they discover last. They look at their fatigue and think about sleep, or burnout, or willpower, but rarely about myth. Yet myth is not fantasy. Myth is the inner thread that tells you who you are, what you move toward, and why your life matters. When that thread frays, the body follows. Men describe a kind of numbness that doesn't feel like sadness or fear. It feels like drifting, like moving through a life that should feel full but somehow feels weightless. Across countless online spaces, different cultures, different languages, the same confession appears. My life looks fine. I just don't feel anything. The collapse of outer motivation often reflects the collapse of inner meaning. In Jungian terms, this is the loss of personal myth. The story that once carried you forward has died, and nothing new has taken its place. Viktor Frankl, writing from the harshest of human conditions, noted that meaning deprivation creates a vacuum in the psyche. A vacuum not filled with despair, but with heaviness, a lack of propulsion. When a man loses his why, his nervous system naturally downregulates. The world does not feel like something to approach. It feels like something to endure. Many men mistake this state for laziness or apathy, yet the deeper truth is more confronting. The body may be refusing to rise because there is no story worth rising for. This is the midpoint reversal of the entire narrative. The fatigue is not a deficit of energy. It is a deficit of meaning. And here is a line that often disrupts the listener's understanding. The body does not collapse only when it is overwhelmed. It collapses when the inner narrative is no longer believable. If you look closely, some signs become unmistakable. You feel more alive imagining an alternate life than inhabiting your current one. You daydream about a version of yourself that feels authentic, spontaneous, purposeful, yet struggle to move toward it. The contrast between inner longing and outer reality becomes so stark that standing up feels like stepping into someone else's script. The exhaustion becomes existential, a protest against a life that may be functional but isn't meaningful. This is not a judgment. It is an invitation to see your fatigue not as a flaw, but as a compass that has fallen flat so the needle can reset, a compass that refuses to participate in a direction that distorts your truth. In one online reflection, a man described it poignantly. He said he wasn't depressed in the clinical sense. He was storyless. The moment he reconnected with a mission, small, personal, almost invisible to others, he noticed something shift. The exhaustion didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. It stopped being absolute. Every meaningful step he took, even tiny ones, created a faint return of vitality, as if the body were saying, "If you move toward truth, I will give you energy again."
To explore this gently, one optional question can open a surprising door. If my fatigue is protecting me from living the wrong story, what story would feel like mine? There is no urgency here, no demand for dramatic change. The question itself creates space. It lets the body feel heard. It acknowledges that exhaustion may be less of a malfunction and more of a message. At this point in the journey, the tension rises.
Because soon, the body stops merely protecting you from the wrong story and begins urging you, subtly, steadily, toward the right one. That is where we go next, into the final chapter, where fatigue turns out not to be the end of your movement, but the beginning of a new orientation. There comes a moment, often quietly, when a man begins to understand that the urge to lie down all day was never just about exhaustion. It was communication. His psyche had been speaking in the only language he could not ignore, the body. And when that realization finally lands, something inside him uncoils. Not a burst of motivation, not a sudden transformation, but a recognition that feels like stepping into a room where the air is finally clear. All this time, fatigue was not the enemy. Fatigue was the messenger. Throughout this journey, a pattern has been unfolding. The body that refused to rise was not betraying you, it was signaling you. The urge to collapse was not a sign of moral weakness. It was a symbolic rebellion against a life that had drifted away from your truth. It held every phase of the arc you've lived. The rebellion against pressure, the sanctuary for emotions, the negotiation with your identity, the relational signal you didn't know how to express, and finally, the existential protest against a story that no longer reflected who you are becoming. A reframing line here. The exhaustion was coherence, not collapse. If you imagine a compass dropped on the floor, lying flat, unmoving, it looks broken. But that position is exactly what allows the needle to stabilize again, to find direction. The body works the same way. When your inner world becomes too chaotic or fractured, lying down is not a failure of will. It is the instinctive posture that allows your orientation to return. Stillness is how the psyche recalibrates. Men often fear that rising requires force, willpower, discipline, or a dramatic overhaul. But the deeper truth is softer. A man rises not by overpowering his fatigue, but by realigning with what his fatigue has been pointing to. When the story becomes true again, energy begins to follow. Not all at once, not in heroic bursts, but in steady, grounded increments, like warmth returning to a limb that had gone numb. As this understanding settles, many men notice a subtle shift. The question is no longer, how do I fight this exhaustion? But, what was this exhaustion trying to show me? And that shift marks the beginning of movement. The body, having been heard, no longer needs to shout. The fatigue becomes less of a command and more of a guide. If you want to test this gently, one quiet experiment can often reveal something meaningful. Take a moment, even just a breath, and name one signal from your exhaustion that you now recognize. A sentence as simple as, "My body was refusing because I outgrew that version of myself," or "I needed permission to stop performing," or "I wasn't tired, I was storyless." The point is not correctness, the point is honesty. When you speak one sentence of truth, even to yourself, the body listens. As we close, the invitation is simple and human. If any part of this mapped your experience, you're welcome to share one line of recognition, just one. Not for performance, not for advice, but because your sentence may become the mirror that helps another man recognize his own unspoken story. This is where the horizontal truth leads, not back into the bed as a refuge, but toward a life that no longer requires collapse to be lived authentically.